Melania Trump exposes a racist too. What she does next brings down his entire company. The rain drummed softly against the darkened glass of the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, its rhythm lost beneath the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of fine china. The dining room, bathed in warm golden light, was a portrait of wealth and refinement, crystal chandeliers casting a glow over polished mahogany tables, each one adorned with meticulously folded napkins and plates arranged with artistic precision. The air was rich with the aroma of seared meats and aged wines, a perfume of indulgence that lingered beneath the polite murmurs of the evening's elite clientele. At the entrance, a man stood just beyond the gilded doors, shaking the rain from his shoulders. His clothes were simple, worn jeans, a faded jacket, and shoes that had seen better days. He hesitated, glancing down at his reflection in the rain-slicked marble floor. There was no mistaking it, he looked out of place. But there was something else in his stance, something beneath the surface of his unassuming appearance. A quiet confidence, a stillness that came not from uncertainty, but from understanding exactly where he stood in the world. Taking a breath, he stepped forward. The maitre d', a tall man with a nose perpetually tilted toward the ceiling, barely concealed his distaste as he appraised the new arrival. His lips curled slightly, as if the very presence of this man was an affront to the sanctity of the restaurant's exclusivity. Still, years of experience in customer service kept his tone neutral, if clipped. "Sir," he said, his voice cool and practiced, "may I help you?" The man nodded. "Table for one." The maitre d's eyebrows twitched upward, his eyes flicking once over the man's attire. His voice, though still polite, held the barest edge of dismissal. "I'm afraid we have a very strict dress code. Our guests are expected to adhere to a certain standard." The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering this. Then, with an easy smile, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black credit card, the kind reserved for the world's wealthiest, the kind that didn't just open doors but removed them entirely. He set it on the podium with a deliberate flick, watching as the maitre d's expression shifted in real time. Surprise. Confusion. And then carefully masked regret. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "Of course," the maitre d' said smoothly, his demeanor shifting so swiftly it was almost laughable. "Right this way, sir." As the man followed him deeper into the restaurant, he could feel the weight of eyes settling on him, guests, waiters, bartenders, all of them taking in his presence with quiet speculation. A ripple had disturbed the perfect surface of their evening, and though no one spoke it aloud, the discomfort was palpable. He reached his table, settled into his chair, and picked up the menu, skimming over the words without reading them. He already knew what he wanted. More than that, he knew exactly why he was here. Because tonight, he wasn't just here to eat. He was here to make a statement. The waiter assigned to the table was young, sharply dressed, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that only came from serving the ultra-wealthy for far too long. His steps were quick and measured, and as he approached the table, his eyes barely concealed the hesitation. He had seen the exchange at the front, the moment of tension between the maitre d' and the guest who didn't fit the mold of their usual clientele. Still, he played his part. "Good evening, sir," he said smoothly, pulling a notepad from his pocket. "Would you care for our wine selection this evening?" The man, Baron, folded the menu and set it aside, his posture relaxed. He took in the waiter's stiff stance, the barely perceptible edge of condescension that clung to his otherwise professional tone. "Just water for now," Baron said simply. The waiter's lips twitched slightly. It was an almost imperceptible smirk, but Baron caught it. "Water. No expensive wine. No rare spirits." The assumptions were already being made. "Very well," the waiter said, nodding curtly before disappearing toward the bar. As Baron sat there, he felt the weight of the room on him. Though conversations carried on, there was an undercurrent of curiosity, of quiet judgment. He had seen it in the way guests had subtly turned their heads when he walked in the way waitstaff exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral but not without interest. It wasn't just what he looked like. It was the fact that he didn't belong. Or at least that's what they thought. The CEO of a powerful tech company sat at a nearby table, dressed in a custom suit that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Gerald Whitman. Baron knew the name, knew the man, knew the stories about how his company discriminated against employees of color, how he had been accused of underpaying women compared to their male counterparts. Whitman, completely unaware of who had just entered his world, took one look at Baron and smirked. Just another nobody who had somehow wandered in. Just another poor soul trying to pretend. Baron remained still, waiting. Watching. Let them think it. Let them think whatever they wanted. The waiter returned with the glass of water, placing it down with a little less care than he would have for one of the regulars. "And are we ready to order, sir?" Baron tapped his fingers against the polished table. "Yes. I'll have the filet mignon. Medium rare." The waiter barely suppressed a raised brow. "And the sides? Truffle mashed potatoes and the asparagus?" The waiter jotted it down, though his expression flickered just slightly. The choices were deliberate. The most expensive cut of meat on the menu. The priciest sides. The test. The waiter's eyes flicked toward Baron's clothes again. The worn jacket. The scuffed shoes. And then, a moment of hesitation. "Would you like to hear about our specials?" the waiter asked, his voice carefully measured. Baron leaned back, tilting his head slightly. "No," he said smoothly. "That will be all." The waiter nodded stiffly and walked away. Whitman, sitting just 2 tables over, let out a soft chuckle. "Good luck paying for that one," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Baron didn't react. But Melania Trump did. She had entered the restaurant silently, unnoticed at first, her presence effortlessly commanding. Unlike Baron, no one questioned her place here. Because when Melania Trump walked into a room, people noticed. She had been watching the exchange from across the restaurant, having arrived a few minutes later. And in that moment, she decided it was time to make herself known. She took a step forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The hushed conversation near Whitman's table faltered as she approached. Whitman's smirk vanished the second he realized who she was. "Mrs. Trump," he said, clearing his throat as he straightened in his seat. "I didn't realize you were dining here tonight." Melania didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she turned to Baron's table, sliding into the seat across from him as if she had always been meant to be there. The room shifted. Waiters stiffened. Guests exchanged quick glances. Whitman's jaw tensed as he forced a polite smile. "I thought..." Melania finally turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "It's fascinating," she said, her voice smooth, every syllable deliberate. "How quickly people reveal who they really are when they think no one important is watching." Whitman paled. I don't know what you mean." Melania tilted her head slightly. "Oh, I think you do." Silence. One of the waiters rushed forward, suddenly flustered. "Mrs. Trump, would you like us to prepare a table for you?" Melania smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No," she said. "I'll dine here. Right where I belong." The words were pointed. The message clear. Baron had belonged in this restaurant before anyone even knew who he was. But now he wasn't just a guest. He was a statement. Whitman, suddenly looking deeply uncomfortable, cleared his throat again. "Well, I hope you enjoy your meal." He shifted in his seat, glancing at his wife, who looked equally unsettled. Melania let the silence stretch between them before finally speaking. "Oh, we will." She turned her attention back to Baron, effectively dismissing Whitman entirely. Whitman, realizing there was nothing more he could say, hastily turned back to his own table, his mood completely soured. The power had shifted. Baron, watching all of this unfold, lifted his glass of water and took a slow sip. Melania's lips quirked slightly. "You always did have a way of making people uncomfortable in the best way." Baron smirked. "I learned from the best." The waiter, now visibly panicked, returned with the food far faster than normal. He carefully placed the plate down, his hands shaking slightly as he set the filet mignon in front of Baron. "Sir, please enjoy your meal," he said quickly before disappearing. Whitman had gone silent. The other guests, who had once sneered and laughed, now watched with forced politeness, suddenly unsure of how to behave. And Baron? He picked up his knife and fork and took his time, savoring every bite. Because this This was how you exposed the truth about people. Not through anger, not through shouting, but by letting them reveal themselves. And then, by letting the world see exactly who they were. The atmosphere in La Maison Royale had shifted completely. Just minutes ago, the wealthy patrons had chuckled under their breath, whispering about the poor mans who had wandered in. Now, after Melania Trump's arrival, those same people sat rigid in their seats, eyes darting anywhere but toward her table. Whitman, the once arrogant CEO, kept his head low, his shoulders stiff. He had spent years cultivating an image of power, of control, of superiority. And now, he had been exposed. Not just to Melania, but to everyone. The staff moved differently now. The same waiter who had spoken to Baron with such thinly veiled condescension now hovered nervously nearby, checking on him as if his entire career depended on it. And maybe it did. Baron, calm as ever, continued cutting into his steak, taking his time. Melania sipped her wine, her expression unreadable. She had done what she needed to do. The restaurant had seen who Whitman really was. And soon, the rest of the world would too. The exposure begins. The next morning, Baron woke up to exactly what he had expected. His phone was buzzing nonstop. News alerts, text messages, missed calls. He scrolled through the headlines, each one making him smirk just a little more. Billionaire CEO caught in public humiliation. Melania Trump witnesses the whole thing. CEO who discriminated against restaurant guest gets a taste of his own medicine. The night Whitman's career took a hit he never saw coming. It had begun. Someone at the restaurant had recorded everything. The waiter's dismissal of Baron. Whitman's smug remarks. Melania's sharp response. And now, the video had gone viral. Thousands of comments flooded social media. This is exactly how these rich elites treat people they think are beneath them. They only respect power. Melania just sat down, and Whitman folded like a cheap suit. The way Baron just ate his steak after proving everyone wrong, absolute legend. Baron leaned back against his couch, scrolling through the reactions. Then, another notification popped up. An internal memo from Whitman's company. Baron clicked on it, reading through the carefully worded damage control. At Whitman Industries, we pride ourselves on fostering a culture of inclusivity and respect. Recent events do not reflect our values, and we are taking necessary steps to address this situation internally. Translation? Whitman was panicking, and it was only going to get worse. The corporate fallout. Whitman paced inside his sprawling office, the city skyline stretching behind him. His executives sat in silence, each of them avoiding eye contact. No one dared to speak first. Finally, his PR director cleared her throat. "This isn't just bad," she said carefully. "This is catastrophic." Whitman scowled. "It was one dinner," he snapped. "People will forget." The PR director winced. "Sir, but they're not forgetting." She turned her laptop screen toward him, playing another clip that had gone viral. It wasn't just the restaurant incident. It was a former employee speaking out. A young woman, sitting in a well-lit home office, staring into the camera with a measured calmness. "I worked at Whitman Industries for 3 years," she said. "And what you saw in that video, that's exactly what it's like behind closed doors." Whitman's stomach dropped. Then another video surfaced. Then another. More and more former employees came forward, sharing their own experiences. The internet dug up old lawsuits, old scandals. The narrative had shifted. This wasn't about one bad night. It was about a pattern of arrogance, discrimination, and abuse of power. His entire empire was under fire. And then came the worst news of all. His biggest investors were pulling out. One by one, companies distanced themselves. His stock price dropped. And for the first time in years, Whitman felt something he never had before. Powerless. The final blow. A week later, Melania sat across from Baron in a private lounge, sipping her tea gracefully. "Well," she said lightly, "I hear Whitman is having a terrible week." Baron smirked. "I'd say that's an understatement." Melania placed her cup down carefully. "You knew this would happen." He shrugged. "People like him? They don't change. They just think the rules don't apply to them." Melania studied him for a moment, then nodded. "And yet, You didn't even have to do anything. The world handled it for you." Barron smiled. That's the best part. Whitman had done this to himself. No lawsuits. No direct takedowns. Just one moment of arrogance, caught on camera, amplified by the truth. Melania exhaled softly. It's fascinating, isn't it? The way power can shift so quickly. One moment, he's on top of the world. The next, she gestured to the headline on her phone. Gerald Whitman resigns. Company in free fall after PR disaster. Barron leaned back, stretching his arms. Poetic justice? Melania smiled. Indeed. Whitman had built his empire on status, wealth, and arrogance. But he had forgotten one simple truth. Power doesn't come from how much money you have. It comes from how you treat people. And in the end, that's what brought him down. The chaos surrounding Whitman's downfall only grew in the following weeks. What had started as a single viral moment in a restaurant had become a full-blown corporate meltdown. More whistleblowers stepped forward. More investors backed out. More of the public turned against him. And for the first time in his career, Whitman had no control over the narrative. He had spent years building an empire based on status, power, and intimidation. But now, none of that could save him. His company's board, once filled with yes-men who feared him, now saw him as a liability. Within 2 weeks of the scandal breaking, a secret emergency meeting was held. And at that meeting, the decision was made. Whitman had to go. The next morning, headlines broke across every major news outlet. Gerald Whitman removed as CEO, company stock plummets. Corporate giant falls, toxic leadership finally exposed. Whitman sat in his private penthouse, staring at the television, watching his own downfall play out in real time. His phone was silent. The people who had once admired him, feared him, and worked under him, none of them were calling. Because he wasn't powerful anymore. Because he had nothing to offer them now. His name, once a symbol of success, had become a joke. And the worst part? There was nothing he could do to stop it. The aftermath, Melania's perspective. Sitting in a quiet private lounge, Melania Trump scrolled through the news, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Barron sipped his coffee, scrolling through his own phone with amusement. Whitman's finished, he said simply, setting his phone down. Couldn't have happened to a more deserving guy. Melania took a slow breath, setting her phone aside. People like him think they're untouchable, she murmured. Until they aren't. Barron smirked. It's funny how fast things change. Melania tilted her head slightly. Is it funny? Or is it just the truth revealing itself? Barron leaned back in his chair, thinking about that. It was true. Whitman hadn't been ruined by lies. He hadn't been brought down by some personal vendetta. He had been exposed by his own arrogance. By his own behavior. By the people he had hurt along the way. And once the truth came out, everything else collapsed on its own. Melania exhaled softly. Power isn't about how much money you have, Barron, she said. It's about who stands by you when you lose it all. She gestured toward Whitman's latest headline. He had everything, she continued. And the moment he lost it? She let the silence answer the question for her. Whitman's last attempt to save himself. Days after his removal as CEO, Whitman sat in a high-rise law office, surrounded by attorneys, PR specialists, and the last few people willing to return his calls. This isn't over, Whitman growled, his fists clenched against the table. One of his lawyers shifted uncomfortably. With all due respect, sirs, it might be. Whitman's jaw tightened. Then fix it. File lawsuits. Threaten media outlets. Make this go away. The room was silent. No one spoke. Finally, one of the PR specialists sighed. Sir, this isn't something you can scare away. The problem isn't the media. The problem is you. Whitman's face darkened. Excuse me? The PR specialist leaned forward, choosing her words carefully. People don't hate you because of the story. They hate you because they already knew it was true. This just confirmed it. Whitman's stomach twisted. That was the real problem, wasn't it? This wasn't one mistake. This wasn't one bad night. This was a pattern. And now, the world saw him for what he really was. A second chance, for the right person. While Whitman was watching his empire collapse, another story was beginning. A woman, one of his former employees, one of the many who had been wronged under his leadership, was now being interviewed on national television. Her name was Angela Ruiz. She had worked for Whitman's company for 8 years, only to be fired for speaking out about discrimination. She was sitting across from a top news anchor, telling her story. "I knew something would happen eventually," Angela said, shaking her head. "I just didn't know it would happen this fast." The anchor leaned in. "What do you mean?" Angela exhaled. "People like Whitman, they don't fall because of one scandal. They fall because deep down, no one actually respects them. People tolerate them because they have money, but the moment they slip, everyone walks away." The anchor nodded. "And what about you? What happens now?" Angela smiled, a new kind of confidence in her eyes. "Now," she said, "now I get to build something better." The camera cut to Melania Trump watching the interview from her own home, a small smile touching her lips. Angela had been one of the many employees who had spoken up. And now, she was about to get the opportunity of a lifetime. Because Melania had been paying attention. And unlike Whitman, she believed in lifting people up. The call that changed everything. Angela's phone rang late that evening. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter. But when she picked up, a familiar, elegant voice spoke on the other end. "Angela," Melania said, "I saw your interview." Angela's heart skipped a beat. "But, Mrs. Trump, You spoke the truth," Melania interrupted. "And I admire that." Angela swallowed hard. "Thank you, but why are you calling me?" Melania's voice was calm, deliberate. "Because I have an opportunity for you." Angela sat up straight. "An opportunity?" Melania continued. "I believe companies should be built on respect, fairness, and integrity. And I believe you should have the chance to help create that." Angela's breath hitched. "Are you saying?" "I want you to help me start something new," Melania said. "A company where people like Whitman never get to make the rules again." Angela felt tears prick at her eyes. For so long, she had felt helpless. Like the system always won. But now she had a chance to be part of the change. And she wasn't going to waste it. The final lesson. Melania Trump had walked into that restaurant expecting to have a simple dinner. Instead, she had exposed the truth about a man who had built his career on arrogance and discrimination. And she didn't even have to do much. All she did was sit down and let the world see him for what he truly was. Power isn't about wealth. Power isn't about status. Power is about integrity. And in the end, that's what makes the difference between those who fall and those who rise.